What nobody really tells you is that leadership shrinks your circle, or in fact it can, but it doesn't have to. You do not stop trusting people, you just have fewer places where full honesty feels safe. You cannot always talk down, you cannot always talk across, and sometimes you can't even talk up. I want to talk about something that does not always get named in leadership, and that's loneliness. Not the obvious kind, not sitting alone in an office or being alone, but the quiet kind that creeps in once you are in post. Because headship can be a very strange mix. You are constantly with people, meetings, conversations, emails, decisions, things that centre around people, and yet you can still feel very deeply on your own. One of the biggest shifts in headship is not workload, it's distance. The distance between what you can say and what you can actually say. The distance between what you're carrying and what you can share. These are things you know that you cannot unknow. These are things that you hear that you cannot repeat. Decisions you make that you cannot fully explain to other people. And over time, that can create separation. Not because you obviously want it to, but because the role often demands it. What nobody really tells you is that leadership shrinks your circle, or in fact it can, but it doesn't have to. You do not stop trusting people, you just have fewer places where full honesty feels safe. You cannot always talk down, you cannot always talk across, and sometimes you can't even talk up. And so you hold it. And holding it becomes normal, becomes a normality. Until one day you realise you have not really said out loud how this feels for quite a long time. There is also a particular loneliness that comes from being the final decision maker. Even when decisions are collaborative, even when you listen carefully, even when you involve others. At some point, it stops with you as the leader. And when things go well, of course, you deflect the praise. When things go wrong, you absorb the blame. That imbalance can quietly wear people down. Another layer of loneliness comes from pace. You are moving really quickly, constantly switching contexts, rarely finishing a thought before the next thing arrives as a head teacher. That doesn't leave much space for reflection, and reflection is where meaning lives. And without it, leadership becomes transactional. You start surviving the role rather than shaping it. I think this is why networks matter so much in headship. Not performative networks, not conference small talk, but real ones. People that you can rely on. That kind where you can say, actually, I'm struggling with this, or I'm not sure I'm handling this well, or I feel exhausted and I don't know why. Helping you out with a problem that you know they might have experienced. If you don't have those spaces, leadership becomes isolating really quickly. One of the most dangerous myths in educational leadership is that strong leaders cope quietly. They don't. They do not cope on their own. Sustainable leaders talk. They have a network. They reflect. They process. They seek perspective and experience. Not because they're weak, but because leadership is not meant to be carried alone. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, I want to say this really clearly. Feeling lonely in headship does not mean you are failing. It means that you're a human. It means you are carrying responsibility seriously. The question is not whether loneliness appears. The question is whether you notice it early enough to respond to it. Sometimes the response is as simple as finding one trusted person, that inner circle, One conversation where you do not have to perform. One space where you do not have to be the head. Sometimes it's about building habits that protect reflection, or creating boundaries that stop the role consuming everything. Sometimes it is about admitting that the way you are working is not sustainable, even if it looks successful from the outside. Leadership does not have to be lonely. Far from it. But it does require intention. And it requires permission. Permission to reach out, permission to speak, permission to say, I cannot do this entirely on my own. That confidence in that network, the inner circle, and the people that you trust. If something in this episode resonated, sit with it for a moment. Leadership is not meant to be carried in silence. If this conversation helped you feel less alone, that matters. This is Headship After Hours. We'll keep talking and we'll keep connecting.